If there's one thing people love more than lists, it's negativity, so I thought we would combine those two things and talk about the 5 things that suck about the Sony a6700. To be clear, I don't think this camera sucks. I actually quite like it, and I think it's very impressive, but there are some definite downsides, and I just want to kind of give you those without any garnish. Just so you know, if you're thinking about buying this camera, I want you to have all of the facts, or all of my impressions about how this camera operates. I might be jumping the gun a little bit. I've only had the camera for a few weeks, and these are the things that kind of stick out to me as negatives. And there could be more down the line, or maybe less as I use it more and more. I'm filming this video on the FX30. That should give you an idea of what the video quality can be like on the a6700. They should look identical. Let's not beat around the bush and talk about the number one thing that sucks about the a6700, and that's overheating. Sony has already introduced a new firmware, which doesn't say anything about overheating in the firmware notes, but it does say something about stability and just sort of operational improvements. And a lot of people take that to mean that it improves the bad performance in terms of heat management. Some YouTubers have already come out and said de facto that it does improve thermal performance. I'm not really ready to go there. I did some overheating tests before installing the new firmware, and I thought that 4K 24 frames per second was pretty reliable, or about as much as you could expect, or as reasonable as you could expect from a camera this size. Essentially, I was able to run it for well over an hour, and I just kind of stopped the test because it didn't seem as if it was going to overheat. And I was outside on about a 93-degree Fahrenheit day in the shade. But there's also a lot of other variables that I haven't really explored in regards to overheating, all the different codec options, the quality options that you have in this camera, the H.264 versus H.265, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a ton of variables that might play into whether or not this camera overheats. Regardless of the firmware improvements, I just can't imagine that this is going to be a super reliable and rock-steady video camera if that's what you want it to be. The form factor alone and all of the power and capability that is in this camera, it just isn't realistic to expect that. I think if you're realistic about what this camera is, you probably won't be disappointed because it is a hybrid camera. It's a really great photo camera that also can shoot really excellent video, but I wouldn't call it a video first camera. The next negative for me is the rolling shutter. In 4K 24, 4K 30, the rolling shutter is pretty good. It's not outstanding, but it's better than average, I would say. However, when you go up to 4K 60 and even 4K 120 with that really small crop, it has much worse rolling shutter performance. A lot of people will say that, you know, if you're not doing fast whip pans of the camera, then a rolling shutter doesn't matter. I, however, think that that is not the whole picture. Really, anytime that anything is moving quickly in the frame, that can introduce issues with rolling shutter. But also, if you're just moving the camera around, not even trying to move it quickly, any sort of movement of the camera, any bump or bounce or jerk of the camera can introduce some rolling shutter problems or rolling shutter artifacts that will mess up the image. My next complaint has to do with the lack of options that Sony gives you in terms of resolutions and formats that are available when recording video. As usual for Sony, you only have the option to record in 16:9 aspect ratio in either 4K or 1080p. In comparison to some of the other cameras from Fujifilm like the XS20, which allow you to take better advantage of the bigger resolution or the higher resolution of some of these cameras. You can actually shoot in 6K as opposed to a 6K downsample into 4K. You can shoot in 16:9, 17:9, and also a 3:2 open gate mode, which gives you the full sensor readout in video. Maybe you wouldn't take advantage of those options all the time, especially that open gate mode. Prior to social media sort of taking over our lives, open gate was really relegated to high-end cinema cameras that were shooting anamorphic. But now that short form videos are becoming more prevalent, it's a lot easier to get a vertical video and a widescreen video out of one single frame if you shoot it in 3:2. I'm not going to complain that it has micro HDMI because this is a tiny camera, and there are some full frame cameras out there to this day that have micro HDMI on Canon. But what I will complain about is the SD card slot is on the opposite side of the camera as every other Sony camera that I have used up until this point. Maybe it's a common feature of the APS-C cameras, I'm not really sure, but the bigger cameras all have the SD card slot on the same side as the battery door. And I don't know, it's just a muscle memory kind of thing. So I'm always fumbling around with this camera looking for the SD card slot, but it's over here. Also, I feel like the orientation of the card is also reversed from the other cameras, so I'm always trying to stick it in the wrong way.
That's what she said.
Michael, please. Please.
Now, if you don't have other Sony cameras or you don't have a lot of experience with them, it's not going to be a big deal. This will be, you know, whatever. That's how it is on this camera. But if you are mixing and matching different Sony cameras, it is kind of annoying that the card is on the other side of the camera. The last negative that occurs to me so far with this camera is that the buttons and dials are all a little bit cramped and a little bit small in comparison to, you guessed it, the bigger cameras. Now, a lot of this stuff seems pretty obvious. Hey, it's a small camera, that's sort of its thing, and it's to be expected that everything is therefore a little bit smaller. I get it. Doesn't mean that it isn't a little bit difficult to use. Maybe it'll get better over time. They did introduce a front dial on this one, so you have a front dial that you can program to whatever. So that's good that you have that, but the placement of all of these dials here, so you've got the power switch here, the aperture dial or whatever, the front dial right underneath it, and on the back you've got this one for shutter, for me anyway. Then you've got your PASM selector, and underneath that you have the mode selector, so that goes from photo to video to S&Q. All really great functionality, but it can be a little bit tricky to figure out which one you're actually touching unless you look down. Oftentimes I have been trying to change my aperture and I'm just sort of brushing up against the on and off switch. Sometimes I'm trying to switch my shutter and I accidentally switch modes. So everything is just a little bit small and cramped together. I'm sure it'll get better over time as you get used to it. The buttons, on the other hand, are relatively the same size as they are on the bigger cameras. Again, they're just kind of all mushed together a little bit more. The one that's a big problem is the custom one button over here, which by default is set to white balance. And that's a pretty important button or function, but it can be really hard to find this unless you look at it and press it. So it doesn't bump out from the body. And I think they did that on purpose so that you don't accidentally press it. So you really do have to find it and deliberately press it in, which I guess is good, but it also makes it difficult to find that button unless you look at it. Those are my 5 major complaints, but I've got a couple bonus complaints. The first one is the return of the dangly camera straps. Pretty minor, which is why it's not on my numbered complaint list. They jangle around and make noise. The next bonus negative has to do with the LCD in the EVF, and I didn't include these in the numbered complaints because it's pretty typical for Sony. The rear LCD on this camera is pretty low res. It's about 1.04 million dots, I believe, which is less than the competing cameras, the XS20 and the Canon EOS R7. Both have higher resolution rear LCD screens. The EVF also is fine in terms of brightness, in terms of resolution. It's pretty much the same as you'll find on the XS20 and the EOS R7. Where it is a little bit problematic is that it's so small, and especially if you wear glasses like I do, it can be very difficult to actually see the entire image when you are looking through that EVF. So I have to sort of maneuver the camera around and move my eye up and down, left and right, in order to see the whole image that I'm capturing. Not only is it hard to see the whole image, but it's also really difficult to see the info display above and below the image when looking through the EVF. Let me wrap up by recontextualizing some of these negatives. A lot of them have to do with the fact that this is a small camera, and that is not news. Where the size of the camera is actually problematic and a real detriment to the operation of the camera is in the overheating. And regardless of that new firmware, I don't think this camera is ever going to overcome that limitation. There's a lot more testing that I could probably do to figure out when, how, and why this camera is going to overheat. But I feel like if you want to maximize the quality of the camera, like you can do on the FX30 or the A7S III or even the A7 IV, shooting in 4K, 422, 10-bit, all the highest quality options, high frame rates, etc., you're gonna run into overheating problems with this camera. Another thing that induces overheating is using the HDMI. Using the HDMI out somehow makes the camera get hotter faster. I wouldn't call this a pocket cinema camera, given all of the issues that you might have shooting video with this camera, but it really reminds me of the pocket cinema camera. The newer generations of pocket cinema camera from Blackmagic are nowhere near this small, compact, and adorable. They really kind of got a case of gigantism. This one is much more in that spirit of really tiny, pocketable, almost just super, super powerful camera, and that's kind of cool. Both of these, because of their small size, have significant limitations. There's really no getting around the physics of it. I mean, maybe in the future, but as of now, limitations because of their small size. They really just pack in as much of the capabilities as they possibly can and just sort of let the user do their best. Anyway, I'm sweating and it's time to go. Those are my 5 things that suck about the Sony a6700. Let me know what you think. Am I blowing things out of proportion, or am I underselling some of the negatives? I'm gonna keep making content about the a6700 for a while, so if there's anything that you would like to know, please let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you later.